Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the evaluation report of Alexandria Reoccurring Income for Success and Equity, ARISE, Alexandria's Guaranteed Income Pilot. We're so thrilled to have Juliana Sciutto here presenting the evaluation findings from the ARISE program on behalf of Apt Global. Apt Global is an independent research and consulting firm that conducted the evaluation. While the project's principal investigator was unfortunately unable to join today's presentation, Juliana has been deeply involved in the evaluation since its inception. She conducted participant interviews and co-authored both the interim and final evaluation reports. Juliana, thank you so much for presenting these findings for us today.
Thank you, Julie. This presentation is just going to be a small window into a program that spanned over 2 years and had a lot of moving parts, a lot of people and organizations who were involved, and I'm just showing like little snippets of it. Like Julie just mentioned, we have an interim report, and that's on the first year of the study, and then the full report that I'll be presenting on today covers the full pilot, and you can read our either reports with all the data and all the methodology and all the like nitty-gritty details on the ARISE website. So like I said, I am just a representative of a big team of people and organizations who supported this project. As Julie mentioned, APT was hired to evaluate the ARISE program, and we did that by analyzing the data we collected through surveys, interviews, and observations that I'll walk you through during this presentation. I had the distinct privilege of working with Julie and Lisa over 2 years and was one of the interviewers for this evaluation. So I just really spent a lot of time with the people that ARISE was able to serve, and I'm presenting our findings today from the perspective of this qualitative interview. So today I'm just going to walk through a very brief overview of our methodology that we use to analyze the program, and then we'll mainly focus on what we found from the research we conducted, and then I'll open the floor for questions. So guaranteed income, or GI, gives people recurring cash payments that they can use on any expenses they'd like. In other words, it provides cash with no strings attached. The thought behind giving people GI is that the person receiving the GI is better positioned than anyone else to know how to improve their own lives, so they'll spend the GI in a way that makes sense for them and their households. We researched the topics that you see on the screen. So through our research, we learned about how GI impacted people's quality of life in households that had children, how did it impact their children and their parenting styles, and what impact GI had on the mental and physical health of people, among other topics. When the application for ARISE opened in October of 2022, the city of Alexandria received over 4,000 eligible applications. Of those, 170 residents were randomly selected to receive GI. I want to explain really briefly so I don't confuse people throughout this presentation. So the pilot was originally a 2-year program, so 24 months, and that was funded by the American Rescue Plan. Before the pilot ended, the City Council voted to extend the pilot an additional 5 months. So for this presentation, I'll use the terms like over 2 years and 29 months interchangeably, and that's just to indicate the whole duration of the pilot or the program. So for over 2 years, ARISE gave 170 residents $500 per month on a debit card that they could use in stores, online, or by withdrawing cash. Over 29 months, participants received a total of $14,500 each. Once they were formally in the program, even if the participants' circumstances changed, like if they made a higher salary than what was like the minimum threshold, or they moved out of Alexandria, they continued to receive the GI without interruption. So this is a big picture overview of how ARISE was evaluated. It began with the application itself, which doubled as a survey to get a baseline idea of how people were doing financially, mentally, and emotionally at the time of application. We had a short check-in survey at 6 months and 18 months, and longer, more comprehensive surveys at 12 and 24 months to get a fuller idea of how Alexandria residents were doing. So Through the surveys, we compared two groups of people called the treatment group and the control group. The treatment group applied for and received GI. Those are those 170 people that were randomly selected. The control group is who we compare the treatment group to, and those folks applied for ARISE, were eligible, but were not randomly selected to get it. And I just want to mention that we did provide financial incentives, so gift cards, in our case, to people who took the survey to thank them for their participation. And I just want to say how grateful we are to both the treatment and the control group for taking our surveys to give us all the robust information that we'll talk through today and that we were able to analyze in our report. So before I move on, I just want to kind of direct you to this like March 2023 ethnographic study begins note on our timeline. So an ethnography, it's essentially spending a lot of time with a group to better understand them. So in our case, we had this little sub-study of a group of 12 single parents that were receiving GI that agreed to have in-depth interviews, monthly check-ins, and in-person visits in order to get a deeper understanding of how GI impacted their lives as parents, and in particular as single parents. We sat down for just under 30 formal interviews over the course of the pilot, which gave us a lot of information about their parenting style, how they were feeling. But the moments that I personally take with me as someone who did a lot of the ethnographic interviews are the times these parents invited us into their homes and into their lives. We talked around kitchen tables. We went to the park with their children. We cheered their kids on at soccer games. Doing daily tasks with these parents, like going grocery shopping and going to the craft store to get materials for their hobbies, allowed us to build relationships and get a better sense of their lives and how they were changing over the 2 years we were spending with them. This gave us a front row seat into the impacts that receiving GI was having on these 12 families, and we are just so grateful to them for sharing their lives and their stories with us. We collected a lot of data through surveys and interviews and the conversations I just mentioned with our ethnographic group. You can see just a bit of all the information we collected here on the screen, from financial well-being, housing stability, all the way to asking people to describe how their lives have been impacted by GI by using their own words. And then again, what changes or suggestions they would have for the program overall. And so on the left, you see the quantitative data, and that's what we collected through surveys. And then on the right is the qualitative data that we collected through these extensive interviews that we had. I'm going to talk to you about the average ARISE participant, but I just want you to like conceptualize, or like I want to ground this discussion in that these are real people in your community. Throughout our reports and this presentation, we used fake names and took out identifying information to protect the personal identity of these participants. But I want you to imagine who these people are when you think about these results, when you hear these quotes and these stories. These are your neighbors. They're moms at the park. They're people you see at the grocery store. Their kids are in school with your kids. They might be your coworker. They might work at your doctor's office. These are real people who live in your community and who were directly impacted by this program. So with that in mind, the average ARISE participant was a 43-year-old and a female. More than half of participants lived with children. The median household income among participants was less than $22,000 annually, and the average household income was around $24,000. To put this in context, in Alexandria, the overall median household income is over $110,000 a year. So even adding of the full $6,000 a year of ARISE income, participants were still earning less than a quarter of the median household income. A little over half of these participants used some sort of public benefit, and the vast majority were working and had experienced food insecurity in the month prior to applying. So I just want to highlight that these participants were living in poverty in an expensive city at their very baseline. So I'm sure you all want to know, like, what did you find? What did the findings say? So this is what we found. Many of the people we interviewed shared experiences of living with profound financial insecurity before Arise began. So this financial insecurity led to emotional and psychological distress. We just saw that they made about 1/4 of the median household income. 70% were food insecure, even though they were working. This is a really financially vulnerable population. Catherine was a young single mother of 3 that lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Alexandria. Catherine worked 2 jobs just to make ends meet and still regularly came up short. She shared this quote about her experience applying for Arise. She said, "As I was completing the application, the questions just made me so emotional because a lot of them I could answer yes, and I need support. And you would think the yeses were good things, but it was things like, well, do you skip meals? Well, do you have emotional moments? Do you feel hopelessness?" Her emotional response to these questions highlights the emotional toll that the financial insecurity in her daily life was creating. But we found that Arise gave participants breathing room. As you can imagine, when Arise participants began the program, they were struggling to cover everyday expenses in a city with a high cost of living. They carried credit card debt, payday loans, and utility debt to get by. The graph you see on the screen demonstrates Arise participants in blue compared to control group participants in green. Again, control group participants applied and were eligible to get GI, but were not randomly selected. These graphs show that Arise participants reported higher amounts of financial stability in some metrics compared to control group members. So I want to talk to you about Caitlin. Caitlin was one of my ethnographic participants. She's a single mother of 2 children who was struggling financially with bills that exceeded what she made on a monthly basis before Arise. Her electric bill one month had reached over $1,000, and she was really behind on utility payments. She frequently had to tell her children no when they asked to do activities or go places because she simply could not afford it. Caitlin described herself as robbing Peter to pay Paul, borrowing money from others and repaying it back a little bit at a time when she could. She had constant financial stress, and she felt like she could only give her kids basic necessities like food and shelter. By the middle of the pilot, Arise had changed Caitlin's financial stability and quality of life. She was able to catch up on bills, especially her electric and water bills, and pay new bills on time or only a few days late. The GI even allowed her to create an emergency fund that reached over $1,200, which she used to cover a $600 car repair emergency. Most significantly to her, she was able to say yes to her daughter when she asked to do activities like going to Topgolf or an amusement park. Caitlin reported feeling, in her own words, way better and more optimistic about her financial situation, with significantly less stress in her daily life. The data we collected reflected what Caitlin experienced. Through surveys done 1 and 2 years after the pilot began, we found that Arise participants had significantly fewer payday loans and other debt compared to the control group. And in interviews, 24 participants shared that they had reduced or eliminated their debt entirely. We also used a financial wellness scale to ask people to self-assess their finances, and Arise participants had higher average scores than control group members, showing that they felt better about their finances. Arise gave Caitlin a little breathing room. She caught up on bills. She was able to cover an unexpected expense. Her and her daughter were even able to take a little weekend trip to visit her son in college. During the program, we heard from so many participants about how Arise helped them reduce their stress levels by giving them some temporary relief from their daily financial stressors. In interviews, participants shared that they were feeling calmer and happier while receiving the $500 a month. They often talked about how much relief they felt. Tiffany was a single mother who often had to go without food because of her limited income. She used GI to help cover rent, food, and occasional outings with her son. Tiffany described how not having to worry as much about how to afford the things her family needed really improved how she felt. She said, "I feel different compared to when I wasn't receiving those $500. I don't know. I felt frustrated, kind of like I had no motivation in life or something like that. That's how I felt. And now with the program, no, honestly, I feel good. I really do. I feel like a different person. I feel very, very happy, truly. I just know it has helped us because it helped me control my life, my emotions, all of that. It's helped me. I have been able to smile, to be happy because I was sadder before, very sad, very pensive, not as much anymore. It has helped me to be happy. I had the pleasure of spending a lot of time with Tiffany over our 2-year program, and I was able to see firsthand how much happier she was. I could literally see the weight lifted from her shoulders. I saw her laugh more. I saw her smile more. I heard her joke more. I saw the difference when her and her son moved from a rented room in a shared apartment into an apartment that was just for them. She told me all about the foods that they were eating, like chicken and fruits and vegetables, that they were now able to afford instead of the instant ramen and soups they were living off of prior to the program. Arise really bridged the gap between her limited single income and her and her son being able to live just a little bit easier and more comfortable lives. The data on the impacts Arise had on the quality of life of participants shows a more limited impact, but that's why these mixed methods evaluations of combining the quantitative data that we collect through surveys with the explanations and stories we gather in these really extensive interviews that we conducted gives a much richer and fuller understanding of the whole picture. While our survey data did not reflect significant reductions in stress, the majority of the people we interviewed reported feeling calmer and happier. Arise participants and control group participants reported similar levels of food insecurity, but our interviews show that, like Tiffany, most participants mentioned buying better quality foods or foods that they preferred eating that they weren't able to afford prior to the program. A few participants even mentioned that they either stopped or really sharply decreased their use of food assistance like food pantries during the program. The data do clearly show that Arise decreased homelessness. Arise participants were less likely than control group members to report experiencing homelessness 2 years into the program. In surveys, Arise participants also reported significantly lower levels of household chaos than the control group, showing that Arise helped some participants create more peaceful home environments throughout the program. Again, we see this substantial improvement in the quality of life of all of these areas you see here on the screen, but we saw that these effects often ended when the payments ended, showing them to be temporary. We found through interviews that because of the steady financial help of the program, participants were able to substitute paid work for unpaid work like caregiving and childcare. So on a side-by-side comparison, Arise participants made less money than control group members. Let's take Ian, for example. Ian is a father of twins who worked 80 hours a week. In addition to his primary job that was 40 hours a week, he worked an extra 40 hours a week in the gig economy in order to make ends meet. While working those 80 hours a week, he barely had time to spend with his family. Arise allowed Ian to only work his primary job, reducing his working hours by 40 hours a week throughout the pilot. Because Arise covered the income that his supplemental gig economy job gave him, he was able to instead spend time with his children, taking them to and from school, helping them with homework, and spending quality time together on the weekends. Some participants we interviewed explained how they were able to reduce the hours they worked in order to advance their careers. Like Ian, George was also working 2 jobs, a primary office job and a secondary job in the gig economy. George reduced the time he was working his second job as an Uber driver to take online courses, free online courses, in hopes of advancing his primary job to increase his earning potential. While George was able to invest in his career mobility, the ability for the majority of the participants we talked to and collected data from to invest in their careers or passions was much more limited. Participants widely said they had to use their GI to cover rent and bills instead of being able to enroll in educational programs or make progress on their entrepreneurial goals. People mentioned in particular that education was cost prohibitive and they just couldn't make it work while also working, and that they could not afford to not work even with the GI. So while Arise gave some participants the space to advance their careers, what we really saw was a decrease in working hours that allowed people to invest in themselves and their families without additional financial burden. So although paid work may have decreased, we saw an uptick in unpaid work like caregiving and parenting, like for Sylvia, whose quote you see on the screen here, who was able to arrange her work hours to keep her daughter at home instead of going to daycare because of the flexibility Arise provided her. Arise also increased participants' hope for the future. One way we measure hope and agency being the ability to decide to do something and then to do it, is something called the Adult Hope Scale. Arise participants scored higher than their control group counterparts throughout the entire pilot on the Adult Hope Scale. And you can see that in the graph on the screen here. Interview data showed that the financial security Arise afforded participants gave them a sense of hope that allowed them to plan for the future. In interviews, they shared that the predictability of the funds and the length of the program allowed them to essentially budget better and plan longer term. Many Arise participants mentioned taking steps to improve their lives, like getting new jobs, moving homes, saving money, and exploring career options. Like Christine, who reduced her work hours from 40 hours a week to 20 hours a week to take classes to become a certified nursing assistant to ultimately and hopefully increase her overall earning potential. This is what we'd consider taking a positive risk. Knowing that they had at least $500 to fall back on provided a cushion for people to do things like move and be able to cover the expense of a U-Haul or the security deposit, or decrease their work hours to take classes like Christine or George, who we talked about earlier. These positive risks have costs associated with them, but Arise was able to cover at least some of these costs for some participants. Some people we interviewed also talked about being able to support others in their networks, like being able to donate at their church or send money to their child just because, or support family in need. Claire and her sister lived in the same apartment complex, and when her sister's husband died unexpectedly, Claire was able to purchase extra groceries and cook for her sister and her sister's children, who were not only grieving, but they were struggling financially on now what was a single income. Claire mentioned that without Arise, she likely would not have been able to help her sister or her nieces and nephews in this way, and how meaningful it was for her to be able to do so. This ability to take positive risks, help others, and plan for the future is a testament to the years of support provided by Arise. People felt better able to plan and share with consistent income. And before I move on from this feeling of hope and being able to plan for the future, I wanted to share an example of how meaningful it was to Sylvia, who we heard earlier about being able to keep her daughter at home instead of going to daycare. Sylvia was a single mom to a 4-year-old who wanted to be able to give her daughter a small birthday party. She said, Arise has changed my life in the sense that I was able to plan ahead and say, in August, we're going to do that. I made a plan because I know that money is going to be deposited, so it's something steady, because even a small celebration costs a lot of money. So with the monthly payment, I was able to cover the extra expense. It gives you kind of a peace of mind knowing there's something you can count on. While the context of this is her ability to pay for a small celebration for her daughter, she emphasizes how important to her it was to be able to plan ahead and to be able to count on this money. She used the words, "It changed my life," to describe Arise. This program was so meaningful for the people it served because of its consistency and stability. About half of our participants were parents like Sylvia. The parents we interviewed described a baseline of anxiety, financial stress, and being emotionally drained prior to Arise, which many of those parents attributed to having to say no to their children's requests and finding themselves not being able to be emotionally present, being tired, frustrated, and sometimes angry. We just heard some examples of parents working two jobs that had limited time, limited energy, and limited funds. Throughout the pilot, parents that we interviewed shared stories of how Arise helped put their kids in extracurricular activities, buy them treats and foods they liked, outings to places like Chuck E. Cheese and like takeout restaurants, and spend on meaningful special events like birthday parties or small trips. Parents and children were able to experience fun and joy rather than being in this state of constant survival that they were in prior to the program. Paige talked about being able to afford to enroll her kids in soccer. Paige said, "My son, when I told him that time that I register you in the soccer classes, he was like so excited, so happy. Yeah. He hugged me that time. He was crying. He told me, 'Mommy, is it true?' I told him, 'Yeah, yeah, we go to soccer practice.' And my daughter also. Yeah, she was so happy." Not only were her kids happy, but I could hear in Paige's voice, you don't have the benefit of hearing her, but you could just hear how happy she was to give them that joy. Paige and her kids were able to experience that joy because of the financial relief Arise provided her. We interviewed about 30 people when the program ended to get a sense of how they were feeling, how they were planning for the end of the program, and how they were managing financially. We heard that many participants were increasing their work hours wherever possible, including getting additional jobs that they had been able to go without for the duration of the pilot in order to cover the expenses that the GI had been covering for the previous 29 months. I'll share that some participants are decidedly better off after the Arise pilot. Small but predictable minimum income allowed participants to plan ahead and lower their reliance on credit cards, payday debt, and utility debt. It also allowed some participants to take some financial risks, such as being able to cover moving expenses or a small gap in paid work in order to start a different job. These moves, as we discussed, sometimes require some short-term trade-offs that ultimately allow for longer-term benefits like a higher salary or more housing stability. Arise seemed to have lowered at least some of these barriers for some participants. For other participants, and we saw this in the majority of participants, the relief was more temporary. Alexandria's high cost of living meant that participants used Arise to tackle high interest debt. So as a consequence, they weren't really able to save as much as the Arise money. Paige, who we just heard about her ability and her joy at finally enrolling her kids in soccer, generally used GI to cover her rent or to help with rent. At the end of the program, Paige told us that she was receiving an eviction notice and she needed to seek rental assistance to keep her home. During these offboarding interviews, we also heard that some participants who had been seeking medical care were no longer able to maintain the cost of doing so. For example, Irene was in a severe car accident and needed regular spinal injections to manage her condition. After the pilot ended, she was unable to continue her injections nor the psychiatric care and medications that she had previously been able to access during the pilot because she was unable to cover their costs without the additional income that Arise had provided her. Caitlin summed up most participants' experiences pretty well. This is like kind of generally what we saw. And I'll let you read the quote on the screen, but what I'll highlight is, "But it's like, well, I came up for a second and now I'm back in the slumps." The people who had their basic needs met and had relatively higher paying jobs and less debt were able to do things like buy cars, move out. One person even put a down payment on a condo. For most participants, though, who again were living off of less than $30,000 a year on average, even with the Arise funds, they were able to use the GI to get out of a financial hole they were in and come up to baseline for some temporary relief. And that's when Caitlin's saying, I came up for a second, but now without this income, now she's saying, now I'm back in the slumps. So there is so much data to share, so many people's experiences that I want to tell you about, but I just want to be able to leave time for questions. But just bear with me a few more minutes while I tell you how much people loved and appreciated this program and the people who ran it, since that is in some data that we did collect. Arise participants felt respected and supported by their community, especially those who had experience with public assistance or benefits. They shared how much they appreciated the freedom it granted them to use the funds in the ways that made the most sense for their families. The few people who had moved out of Alexandria talked about how helpful it was and how meaningful it was to them that they could continue to receive the GI even after moving out of Alexandria. Most of the people who moved were able to do so because of the GI, and it really improved their quality of life and their housing. Mostly, people felt so lucky to have been part of this program. They expressed so much gratitude for the city for supporting the program and for the people who ran the program. People had so many kind things to say about the Arise staff. Catherine said, all of you were so patient and kind and handled us with care. I mean, I didn't feel any type of disrespect. I didn't feel belittled. I didn't feel like I was wasting your time. It was just a one-of-a-kind experience, especially if you're coming from a public service sector, like just phenomenal. We talked a lot about whether people feel like they matter in our report and in our research. Arise helped participants regain dignity and feel valued and supported. Some participants shared that they felt like they received meaningful help for the first time, especially those that made too much money to qualify for other assistance programs, but were still struggling financially. I loved this quote from Athena. She ended it by saying, with Arise staff, it's not sympathy, it's empathy, and it's beautiful. I just, again, want to highlight, like, participants spoke so highly of Arise staff, their care, and their patience. They talked so much about staff that went above and beyond to help them connect to resources and help in any ways that they could. I cannot stress enough how many nice things people had to say about Arise staff. So I just want to hit on two more things. What we learned about implementing Arise. So participants heard about Arise through word of mouth from their social networks, like friends and families and places they visit, like daycare, school, and community-based organizations. They also heard about the program through local media and news, which helped many participants understand that the program was not a scam, which was something participants were worried about. Finally, the last kind of method of distribution was that participants saw physical signage and flyers and mailers in their homes and throughout their community, so on buses, but also like brochures that came to their homes. The city put a lot of effort into making sure the word got out about the program, and it shows with the over 4,000 applications from eligible participants that were received. Participants really appreciated being able to incorporate the guaranteed income payments into their existing financial habits through the use of the debit card. Participants could withdraw cash, swipe the debit card at brick and mortar or physical stores, and use it online. And some interviewees talked to us about setting up how they set up auto pay to pay bills directly from the Arise account. People just really valued the flexibility it allowed them. And then finally, Arise helped fill gaps for some participants that weren't covered by their existing benefits, such as helping to buy diapers and covering bills, which highlights both how GI can close financial gaps for participants who receive public benefits without having restrictive rules attached, but also how it can help people who don't qualify for most benefit programs by giving them that little bit of breathing room. So overwhelmingly, I just want to stress that people were just so grateful to have participated in this program, and they were pretty reluctant to provide suggestions or improvements. What we mostly heard was that they wished more people could experience what they had experienced and benefit from this program. Those who did were able to provide some suggestions or recommendations, really talked about how meaningful it would be for them to be able to cover their full rent and what a relief that would be. So people mentioned numbers like $800 or $1,000, just a little bit more substantial so that they could have that much more relief. Others suggested increasing the length of the program for an additional year. We found that in our research that predictable income can help people make longer term decisions and take some of those positive risks that we discussed. And we also kind of saw that people were just kind of catching up on and getting up to baseline in that first year and sometimes even that first 2 years. So right when they were kind of getting into the swing of things and feeling more comfortable, the program was ending. So they did suggest, of course, more and longer would always be welcomed. A few participants discussed the possibility of lump sum payments, so like getting all the $6,000 a year at once instead of in $500 increments. And they mentioned this to make kind of bigger investments in their futures, like a down payment on a home, a car, or paying tuition in a bigger chunk. And while others that we talked to really appreciated the monthly schedule of getting those consistent amounts of money over a prolonged period of time. Finally, just kind of the last thing I'll say here about recommendations is planning for the end of the program is important to minimize financial disruptions where possible. So it may be beneficial in future iterations or programs to reduce payments gradually so that participants can slowly adjust their budgets to get reaccustomed to not having that $500 a month. And this can help people plan ahead and not face such sharp declines towards the end of the program. So just wrapping up and putting myself in your shoes as an audience, and I'm thinking they want to know, so what? So Arise was a thoughtful and intentionally created program that truly helped 170 people. The cost of living in Alexandria and elsewhere, it's not an Alexandria specific issue, but it's just really high, the cost of living. For some people who were already able to cover their basic needs, $500 a month was able to push them into a place where they could get a higher salary or move into better housing that they could maintain and afford even without the additional funds. But for the majority of the participants that truly were living in very difficult financial positions prior to the program, it gave them really meaningful temporary relief and peace. $500 a month helped people get out of the hole they were in, but wasn't necessarily enough to fully pull them out of it for after the program. But just before I open the floor to questions, I want to thank you all so much for being here, for wanting to learn more about this program, and for supporting this program in your community. It's been such an honor to be able to work on this project and to be welcomed into the lives and homes and stories of the participants that Arise served. So thank you so much.
Wow, Juliana, thank you so much. We really just are so grateful to you and the entire APT team for this really thorough documentation of the impact that Arise had on the participants. We know this is a really important historical document to really understand what this bold investment did for city residents. For those of you watching this recording today, I want you to know that questions from the live event will be available in a transcript on the website. I also wanted to let you all know that as you watching the recording might have questions, please feel free to email us at guaranteedincome@alexandriava.gov. We're always happy to continue the conversation. Yeah, thank you, Juliana. There's the our address here at the city where the program staff can answer questions or continue any of the conversation that might be of interest. The entire final evaluation report, as well as this recording, the transcript of the questions and answers from the live report or the live presentation, as well as the slides from this presentation will be available on the website, the Arise website. So Juliana, thank you so much again. We really appreciate the care you took to build such trusted relationships with participants, and we're so grateful to our many community partners with whom we could not have done this without, as well as the participants who clearly just really opened up their lives and their families and their stories to you, Juliana, and to all of us, so we could truly understand the value of this investment. So thank you again, and have a great day.
Thanks, Julie.